Okay. Then I would say, let's go. Welcome to the first official class of the SquidCon 2025. My name is Matthias. I've been a member on the Squidma Discord since almost 6 years now, I guess. I think I joined late 2019 or early 20. So that's roughly 5 years-ish. Since then, proud member. And today I have the honor to take you to this first class for what I expect you to go out after this is to get some basics in, get some tips and tricks that I picked up over the years, the tools I like to use, and then we will also try to put some paint on the mini. I think it will be roughly 3 different parts. First, I will go to tools of the trade, where we have some brushes, what brushes are ideal, should I use a wet bullet or not, what glues to use, then how to build a mini. There's some pitfalls there as well, and some nice tips here. And then in the end, by popular demand, put some paint on the mini and look at paint consistency. And for the mood of this, treat it like you visiting a friend that you wants to show you some stuff, how to paint. You have never seen this before or have started it and want to know how they are doing it. So please feel free to use the chat for any questions. I will have an eye on it. And then, happy to discuss your questions. Then let's go. So what do you need if you want to start painting miniatures? Obviously, you need a miniature that you buy. There's a lot of companies offering those, and pick what you find interesting. I think the easiest thing to get into painting is if you find something that inspires you. That will also probably get you through the inevitable painting slump that you might, hopefully not, but might run through your painting journey, that you feel a bit stressed to get to the painting table. So then getting something or picking something from the table that really inspires you really gets the juices flowing, at least for me. And then, of course, some paints. I mean, there's a equal wide variety of paints that you can find on the market. I have here one from Vallejo and one from Scale. I really like those artist colors. They are quite vibrant. For the beginning, pick something that is available to you, meaning that you can easily restock or without spending ridiculous amounts of money on shipping. Maybe if you have a local friendly gaming store in the area or something that can ship for cheap, get something, or maybe get a starter set. There's some quite famous YouTuber that recently released some starting sets, so maybe there's something in that for you. I personally, when I started my painting journey, I just walked into a workshop store and picked up a starter set that included a couple of paints, a paintbrush, and a clipper. And then I bought a mini. Then when the next day after building it, they primed it for me, and then I started painting. So there's actually not that much that you need to really get into it for starters. Just a brush that is not looking like a banana from the tip, and then you can actually try to start your painting journey. The other thing that you need to put it somewhere. Where do I put the paint? There's the obvious choice, a palette, like a dry palette, like the accomplished painters use for oils and the likes. It's good to use those. But a word of advice here is most of the paints we use are acrylics, and they usually dry relatively quickly if you just leave them somewhere. Even though that's fine for beginning, you will see that you really have to refill colors often. So having something different in your arsenal is really helping. So if you tried it, if you think, oh man, painting feels good and I want to go into deeper, I have 2 hot tips for you that really can kickstart your painting experience and will also make painting easier for you. So if you are behind the first barrier of getting into it, putting some paint on the mini, and you think, hey, this is something I could look into more, then there's 2 options that are not super expensive, also not super cheap, but that will really help you getting 2 levels up even. The first one is a good brush. preferably a sable brush, which is like from the tail fur of a little animal that lives in the far north. And those brushes do behave quite differently compared to the more cheap synthetic brushes, because they have the ability to hold the tip much better and have a much sharper tip. And they're also much more durable if you care for them. So these are quite a lot more expensive than a standard synthetic brush. A synthetic brush you get maybe for a few cents or $1 or $2. These run you at least for $10-15 or more, depending on which size they are. But this is really an investment that I cannot recommend enough. It will really help you. If you lay the base coats down with a synthetic brush and then you feel, why can I get this highlight? Why do I always touch other parts with the brush? This will most likely be the solution to your problem, because those tips are really quite sharp and they hold paint very good. So it also flows very nicely from the brush, so you don't have the feeling you have to scrape the paint off the Mini. So if you have the right consistency, of course, which we'll be coming to later. So having a good brush will really help you, and I felt quite liberated when I got my first one, and I thought, yeah, this is quite a difference. Sorry, Sloof, what do you mean not seeing stuff yet? I just see the comment. Can everybody see me at my setup? Okay, maybe it's then on your end. Good. Let me know if you can see me. Ideally, you see my desk with some stuff on it, my hands crazily waving around, and in the corner, my little face. Perfect. So yeah, that is really something I can recommend. This is a good thing to invest a few bucks into, and I am sure this will really help you in feeling more confident. The second thing, equally important, is a wet palette. Now, there's a few different ways you can approach this. I think there's probably 1 million videos on YouTube on how to build your own with a little box and put some sponge in and some baking paper. Works probably quite well. But there's also a few companies that offer wet palettes that you can buy. So now I have here this beauty, turning it around so you can really see the art. You maybe recognize this. This is the lovely palette that Emil himself designed with his team. But yeah, what is the magic behind a wet palette? I mean, there's a little sponge and water in it, and then the paper where you put the paint on. And the moisture paper that you put on, and it will stay wet and moist for much, much longer. Now, there's a quite variety of things to consider, especially depending on your humidity where you live. I live in Berlin, Germany, so usually I don't feel like the paint is evaporating insanely fast. But there's definitely places where the humidity is that low that you maybe even should consider an air humidifier so that the paint is not drying too quickly. But if you just fill it up regularly, then it stays quite wet for a couple of time, for a couple of days even, if you want, or even longer. I mean, hell, I sometimes went away for vacation for 2 weeks, and the paint was still good, sort of. I mean, not all of them. It depends also on the brand, but it really stays fresh for quite a long time. So don't do it for too long, though. You might get back to a moldy palette. So it's ideally better if you just clean it out and having it drying before you go on break or on vacation. And this one makes you save paint quite a lot, since it actually stays wet and you don't need to refill a drop or two every 10 minutes, which would be what would happen if you have a dry palette. And mixing is much more interesting that way, since it also doesn't dry and you don't have to refill and mix every time. So then you can actually mix and test around a bit. So this is also much more liberating if you want to mix colors. So definitely recommend getting one of these bad boys. So these two things, a good sable brush and a wet palette will, I think, really make the difference for you when you are on your painting journey. Now there's, of course, next to the painting thing, there's rarely the time where you buy build minis. I mean, it's also an option, but definitely you will come to a time where you have one of these things that lie on your desk, a big old sprue that you need to magically transform into a mini. And what do I need for that? So firstly, and there's also it's quite a bit of science around this, and Emil also tested a lot of these bad boys. You need a good sprue clipper or nipper. This is like a little thing that makes you cut the sprue. And the thing is with why some of them seem so darn expensive, there's actually a good reason for it. As I said, I started with the relatively cheap Games Workshop thing, and I mean it works for most parts. But if it's not super sharp, you will actually see when you cut it that it basically damages the plastic. I mean, of course, cutting is also damaging, but it squishes the plastic a bit. So it deforms it. It could also actually happen that when you have the connection from the sprue to the mini, and when you cut it, that there's actually a little hole that you scrape out, so to say. So that's why it's maybe then even more advantageous to not cut directly on the mini, but leave a little bit open and then scrape the rest off with a hobby knife that I will talk to you in a moment. So having one of these that is a sharp version will make you, firstly cut faster, and also doesn't damage the minis. And you cut near the minis, so that is really good. So getting one of these that is also not the cheapest one is definitely something to invest on, but again, not super necessary for the beginning. You will be wonderful with also a cheap nipper that you buy in a tool store or a hobby store. They work all quite the same. There's a difference if you get to one of the better ones, but not super necessary, but definitely something to keep in mind. So now you cut the mini from the sprue, and there's then those nasty mold lines that you sometimes have, and sometimes a little bit of residue from where you cut it from the sprue. So you want to get rid of that, because if you then prime it or paint over it, it usually doesn't look as good and takes you out of the moment when you look at this little mini and see, oh, there's actually a plastic line running over its face. Doesn't look that great. So how to get rid of this? The easiest solution is to get one of these, which is usually quite used tool that you will have in your arsenal is a hobby knife or X-Acto knife. It's just one of those things where you then can unscrew and change the blade. So I guess there will be a time where you hate yourself for it cutting your thumb or you cutting yourself. So this is one of those rights that every hobbyist has to go through. You will have to pay for this hobby with your own blood. Down the line, there's no coming around it, unless you wear like chain gloves or something. So be ready for that. Jokes aside though, be careful with these. These bad boys are quite sharp, but they are very handy to cleaning the miniature, and you can use the back side of the blade to scrape away the mold lines, for example, and then really clean it. And also cut away those little sprue connectors, so it is then nice and ready for you to put it together. You have cut it, now you have cleaned the parts, and now you need to glue it together. Now, there's also resin kits and metal kits. Most of the modern kits that companies use are plastic, so a good plastic glue is your best friend. And for me, putting together plastic minis is much easier than the other two versions that you can have, simply because the plastic glue really melts. Yeah, so no teachers were harmed during the making of this stream. Exactly. Because the plastic glue melts basically the plastic together, so it then forms a solid connection. But on the other hand, be careful, because if you have some glue on your finger and you wipe across the mini's face, it will probably have a thumbprint on it. So also tread lightly when you glue those together. but usually this is the easiest way. There's also a wide variety. I really like this Tamiya Extra Thin because it's really easy to apply, but there's a lot of other companies that use it. Again, use what you get easily. Yeah, as I said, there's also other things. There's resin kits, and for example, or metal kits that you also can put together or have to put together. For that, you need super glue. With plastic glue, nothing will happen. Just putting that out there. So the plastic cement or plastic glue will not do anything for gluing resin or metal. For that, you need good old super glue. And there's also tons of different varieties and companies that make them. One thing that I still have to try that I didn't do yet myself is getting one of these activator sprays, because sometimes you just sit there and hold it together the bits and wait for glue to dry. And with that activator, I understand it just immediately makes the glue stick, which seems like magic to me, and I need to get this. But yeah, you need super glue for that. So maybe some additional things now. Now you have successfully built your mini. And what's next? You could be very dangerously and put paint straight on the bare plastic. There's ways where this might work, but definitely worthy to invest the extra time to prime a miniature. Now, probably the easiest thing to prime a miniature is buying spray can primer. This is the only one that I have left, actually. This is one from GW. This is an aerosol-based spray can, and I wouldn't do this inside, so please go somewhere outside where it's not super annoying to anyone, because it is very, very smelly. Give it a good shake and spray in bursts, and then prime a mini. But yeah, sometimes that is also very weather dependent. If it's really dry or raining or really cold, it might get spotty or splotchy and has texture if you spray. So it's also sometimes a bit annoying if you then prime a mini and then you see there's some chunks on it. So really you have to pick a good day and a good weather for it. There's of course other options that you can use. There's, for example, one I really like is one of these bottled primers. They are, I mean, the biggest purpose for them is to be used via the airbrush, but it's just a liquid primer, and you can just put it on a dry palette or somewhere and then brush it on. This is something that I actually did sometimes when I didn't want to crank out the airbrush and I didn't have a spray can and wanted to prime one mini. This is something you can do. Definitely not something I would recommend for priming armies, since you have to brush the whole thing. But definitely nice if you just want to prime 2 or 3 minis and then get going without the dependency of your airbrush or the can. And maybe the added benefit is you worked your way with your brush around the mini. So then you get to know it a little bit better already. So maybe also a little added benefit. Yeah, and then you have primed your mini. And then you, of course, need to let it dry a little bit. And then you can start painting. A few other things before we get going that are handy for really completing the mini is, besides the paint, that you also don't want to leave it just on this bare plastic base that it comes with. So having something like this is probably the easiest thing. It's like texture paint, and like it's a big old pot of some texture in there, and you can use either a brush you don't really use for anything else, or one of these little applicators, and then you put it carefully on your base, and then you have a little texture. Usually it takes quite a while to dry, so also keep that in mind. And then additionally, you can also use some tufts, put a tuft on there, and then you have basically the base done. Very simple. There's other things like resin that you can use to emulate puddles, or you can also put some little skulls on it. There's your imagination can run wild what you can do, but this will be the simplest thing. Or some texture powder, also a nice thing to add some color. But this is definitely the things that might be the easiest. Also totally fine to just use some thinned down PVA glue and use some sand or dirt you found outside. Now, this is also important. Side note, anything you bring out from the woods, from a nice walk through the forest or the beach, it's generally good to bake that stuff for, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes without burning your house, of course. And if it's tree bark, also not too much, so you don't have a lump of coal in your bake oven. But it's good to get rid of everything that might live in there or crawl in there, like little bacteria. And you do not want this to be in your mini and under the paint, because that could then get to mold or something like that. So good to give it a little bake, give it a little ride through the oven, and then you can put a little bit thin PVA glue on the base, sprinkle some sand over it or some dirt mix and some stones, and then you let it dry, and then you also have somewhat of a nice base that you can put your mini on. Now, one other thing that is a wonderful tip I want to give you, one of my favorites probably, is the whole thing about dry brushing. I mean, it's a whole technique in itself. Finding good dry brush was for me sometimes a bit annoying, because buying dedicated dry brushes, I don't know, from the GW, or I don't know, there's like really fancy other companies that sell you very expensive dry brushes. But one tip from someone is to get a makeup brush. These you can find in any store that sells makeup. This is I don't know, I think it was a $3 brush, and these are usually super soft, and they are perfect for dry brushing. Because the thing that I had with other dry brushes was that it was too stiff, and that it then had a little bit of this chalky finish that you sometimes have with dry brushing. And with this, it is almost not the case anymore. So yeah, if you have an unused makeup brush lying around, or you buy one in the store, try it out. I think it would definitely help you with dry brushing. Definitely did that for me. Great. I mean, what else do you need? In having a tissue or like this little fiber cloth is really handy as well to wipe your hands or wipe the brushes on. There are some very heretic people that put the brushes in their mouth when they rinsed it. So I cannot condone this action. So be as it may, I definitely twist my brushes in that cloth here or in a tissue. Definitely have some kitchen tissue around is always a good idea to wipe away. I don't know if that inevitable wash spill, or you just need to clean something. That is also very handy. All right, I think this is it for what tools you need. So I would say let's maybe look more onto the spruce and what to be careful about when building a mini, unless there are some questions so far. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and then we can discuss these. All right. I mean, I will have an eye on the chat, but I will definitely start with this. So I have here a wonderful sprue of the Quill Team Hurricane Jaegers, and I would just clip out 1 or 2 bits and show you what I discussed earlier on how to take them out and clean them. So one thing that is also important when you build minis, and this is usually what a manual from Games Workshop looks like. From the modern ones, I haven't encountered as much, but sometimes the numbers are not correct. So if you think, am I stupid? This number is not the same as it is on the sprue. The chances are not 0 that this is a mistake. Usually it's a mistake in the manual or on the sprue. So sometimes you need to find it by yourself. But from my experience, at least, that is very rare. But just a general advice that it can happen. And especially with some older kids, the manuals are horrendous because sometimes they don't even have numbers. But the modern ones are actually quite okay. And then, yeah, you have this manual here, and then you put it together, and I just will cut out. So this is the thing that I mentioned, that you can really cut close to the mini if you have a sharp nipper, and then that everything goes quite easily. I think in the beginning you may wonder, because some kits are designed in a way where you really don't know, is this part of the sprue or is this part of the mini? Is this something that I need for the mini? There might be a moment where you accidentally cut something away that was actually meant to be on a mini, but I mean, maybe it's then just battle damage or so. So don't worry, you will figure it out. More often than not, it's actually quite clear. So what I said earlier, I mean, even if you cut quite close to the mini, there's still sometimes some little sprue nipples that are still on the mini, and you can clean it with the back of the blade and then scrap it off. So it's really then blending in with the rest of the mini. And especially here, like there's a back of the jacket, and there's like a little thing, and that just stands out like a sore thumb. So we gently scrape that away, so it's then not visible anymore. Same is with the mold lines that you have sometimes. I mean, that's also quite different between the kits. Some kits barely have any. Some have horrendous mold lines. Also, sometimes the design of how the pieces are rotated. So you have like a mold line that is running across the dude's face, which is super annoying to get away. And maybe he just has a badass battle scar, but yeah, sometimes it's a bit annoying. But the modern kits are still quite good, in my opinion. And then when you're finished, there's also a thing I recommend that you dry fit the pieces to make sure that the parts really fit. Because sometimes it can be that they sort of fit, but are not the exact match. So then you maybe double check the manual if it's really the perfect, or if it's really the pieces that are meant to go together, and then really try to figure that out before you glue together. Because if you then glue together and then figure out, ugh, that wasn't the right pieces that I just put together, I mean, there's a chance if it's just relatively fresh, you can pull it off of each other. But yeah, still not ideal. So for especially for more complicated pieces, it's helpful if you dry fit to see if it really is the right fit for the pieces. So now, yeah, and then you would glue it together until you are finished. And then there's, of course, sometimes the big debate. A question that comes up really often is what to do with hard-to-reach places and with sub-assemblies. So I think that's not an easy thing to answer, but let's take a minute or two to go into this. I try to avoid sub-assemblies as much as I can. Simply just for the consistency of the paint job. I see it in one piece. It's also a bit annoying for me to always consider the different pieces and then putting them back together, see if the highlights are still all consistent. And then on the other hand, why do I need to paint this belt if there's a big gun in front of it? So do I really need to spend the time and paint that belt perfectly if the dude is holding a big shotgun in a way that no one will really ever see that belt that I painted with such with that much time that I invested? So really think about, is it really worth it? I mean, if you do a competition piece, definitely go for it, right? But if it's a mini you want to paint, even for a high standard, for a tabletop, I would only do it if it's really almost impossible to paint it nicely, or I don't know, if you want to airbrush something and it's easy to detach, then go for it. But for me, at least, and this is my personal opinion, I would try to avoid it, or I still avoid it as much as I can, especially if it's then prime black, the thing that you can paint. There's a nice saying, so to say, where you can get your brush into is also not visible, and usually that's the case. I mean, there's situations where it might be different, but usually that's a good thing to remember. If I can reach it easily with the brush, it's also hard to see. If it's prime black, it's in shadow, I'm done. I can continue and focus on the more important areas of that mini. So, but yeah, might be situations where sub-assemblies are the way to go. Yeah, then after you build the mini, as we said, you prime it, leave it to dry. There's also a thing that you can do, which is not super necessary in most cases, but sometimes it can help, is giving it a zenithal. You can actually do that also with a spray can or with an airbrush, or you can also use a dry brush and dry brush white or a light gray over the black mini. So what is it actually for, the zenithal? It is to basically emulate the light that comes from top, from the zenith. So the top is the brightest path, and then below is the darkest path. And if you have a black prime mini and spray some white paint from above, you will have natural shadows where the white paint doesn't reach, and it really helps with picking out the details, which is usually interesting for you to start painting, to see, okay, these are the highlights that I need to remember. And especially important and helpful if you then use, I don't know, translucent paint like contrast or inks, especially through the airbrush, so you can really use that already pre-shaded undercoat. But also, just if it's easier for you to see where the highlights and shadows should go, zenithal can help, but it is not mandatory. But you can also use it with a dry brush and a gently dry brush, so you have a little highlight on there. And then you can start painting, basically. Yeah? Then you have your mini. I have something prepared here. I have this little Tyranid guy, and I would say let's put a little paint on him to talk a little bit about paint consistency, which was one of the things that have been requested to discuss. So yeah, but again, if you have other questions or other things you would like to discuss, feel free to send a message in the chat. So I'm using this wet palette here, as I said. Also a nice thing, it's not super recommended, but I don't want to go about this. Are these little bottles with these little necks. It's super easy to clean your airbrush with or refill your wet palette. So if you see them somewhere, they're cheap and they're handy, but also not super mandatory. Right, so paint consistency. This is something that is probably something you will need to figure out by yourself a little bit, because it also really depends on what you prefer, what your painting preferences are, and also the paints that you use, because paints generally behave a little bit differently and when you thin them. So maybe I don't want to go too much into detail here, but usually most of these paints that you can buy, they are multi-pigmented. So it's not a single pigment, there's a variety of pigments there to achieve the color of that specific bottle. This is Imperial Blue, so there's probably like, I don't know, 3-4 different pigments in there. And generally, the more pigments are in the paint, the more unstable is it if you thin it down. And so if you have single pigment paints, for example, these are usually also very vibrant and are more stable if you put water into them. But then this is also, take this with a grain of salt. Not every paint from every brand behaves the same. So you probably have to test how it is with your paints and yeah, test a little bit. Play with it on your palette, and then you will see. But let's jump into this. So yeah, what color should we paint this little fella? I mean, I have a few colors here on the palette. It's like a bright red, a dark red, an orange. There's a turquoise, a yellow. Any requests what we should do? Let me put the blue here on. Put a few colors in the chat that you would like to see. This can be an actually, how do you say, party type of thing. So actually super fine for me. Let's put those on here. Pink, always a good choice. Okay, great. Then, so now you have the paint on the palette, and it's good to wet your brush a little bit, and then you start basically thinning it a little bit with your brush. And that can be, and there you can really take a bit of time and play around. And then you can also drag it along a bit. Now, what is also important, one thing, if you paint with your brush, make sure you don't overload it, and ideally do not get color into the ferrule. So let me show what the ferrule is before we continue. So you have the brush. These are your bristles here, of course, and this here is the ferrule, so the little metal thing that holds the bristles together. And if you get paint into that, I mean, if it happens in the moment and you rinse it immediately, not a big deal. But if paint dries in there, it's really hard to get out, and it will also then basically, since there's color in there, it will spread the hairs and the bristles. So you probably won't get a nice tip in the end. So especially for your table brushes, make sure that the paint is not going into the ferrule and that you rinse it regularly so there's no paint drying and you have fun with your brush for a good amount of time. So, but go back to thinning. I mean, and then you can really see, this is, especially this pink one here, or this magenta, is relatively thick. This is the scale artist one out of a tube, which is also nice because you don't have to shake it. But also, it's quite thick. You need to thin it quite a lot on your palette, unless you don't want it to get too chunky. So also here depends on the paint, and also different paints or different pigments behave differently. For example, especially legendary difficult is white and yellow, since it's a very weak pigment in a way. That's usually, if you thin it too much, then it will almost not cover. So it's different to get a good balance between but also saturation. And usually, as our Lord and Savior Duncan Rhodes told us, 2 thin coats. For most of the time, it's actually good advice. There might be instances where you have this super opaque paint that covers with 1 coat. That's great. Go ahead and take that win. But more often than not, it's worth it to invest time and do a little thinner. The first coat will probably not look as good and will not cover that well, but the second one most likely will, and then you have a smooth finish. One thing I forgot, now that I have it in my hand, is one of these paint holders. There's also quite a wide variety on the market. This is an old Citadel one from Games Workshop. For me, super practical, and I mean, I also started with just holding it by the base, but definitely something that makes painting for longer periods of time more comfortable. So there's also 3D printable versions that you can find. So whatever you can get easy is good. So and then you put it on, and sometimes you might even have trouble with thinking, why is the paint not sticking to it? Because sometimes when you have the primer on and it's not super matte and it's a little bit glossy, that might lead to the paint not sticking immediately to it. So you definitely need a couple of strokes to really get that paint to stick. So don't wonder, this is what happens in that moment to me with this gray primer. But if you just give it a few strokes, then that will work well. And I can already hear Snow and Dennis giggling for me using strokes so often, even though I cannot see or hear them, but I know they are. And yeah, another important thing that might be an easy thing, but still good to remember, it's always good never to push the brush against your miniature, rather to pull it. Reason is, if you pull the bristles into the miniature, it might actually damage them or even break them eventually. So it's easier to never, there might be times where you have to put it in somewhere, but then you gently pull it away from where you started. This will definitely increase the life of your brush. by quite a lot. Yeah, and then you take your time so that don't miss anything, and then definitely after a few moments the brush so that it doesn't get too dry in here. And as you see, then I usually wipe the excess water away and give it a nice little twirl to get the tip back. And yeah, what consistency is actually good? Is there something that I can recommend in terms of how moist or how thin it should be? That also really depends on what you're trying to do, I would say. I mean, there can also be that you want to just give it a little filter or glaze, then you can actually have it quite thin, that it's really almost just a little touch of that color where you paint over. But it also then means it covers really bad. So but it really depends on what you want to achieve and what coat it is. Yeah, is it the base coat? Is it the undercoat? Is it the mid-tone? Or is it the highlight? Usually want the letter to be a little more thin. A nice general thing that you can maybe compare it with is milk consistency, so that it's not watery but also not super thick. It's like the good fat milk that you get in the store. I know here in Germany we have the good 3.5% fat milk. This is probably the consistency you can go for as a general rule of thumb to have an idea what the paint consistency could be. But then again, sometimes you just want it really thin and just really give it a touch. Or if you, I don't know, want to have that object source lighting, that light that comes from somewhere, give it a little touch of that color, a little just that little yellow shine that is on the side of that dude's face. That is then something that you want to do very thin. But sometimes it's also okay to slap quite thick paint on there. Of course, not as thick as you obscure any details or have some texture on there. Yeah. Then, of course, another thing is when you have those colors here on the palette and you say, okay, I have these colors, but I don't have that exact tone that I have in my head. And I want that tone, but I also don't want to run to the store and look if I can find the right paint. So mix it yourself. So you say, okay, I want this to be a red, but it is, I don't know, maybe give it a little. What actually happens if I put a little black in it? Then you put a little black color and then a little, and then you have something like here. I want to have a little nice gradient. And then you can actually mix a color that you desire. But there's also a few things to be aware about when you mix. That, as I said earlier also, some pigments are much stronger than others. And as you can see here, I hope you can see it, okay? I only took a very light dip of black and I have lots of red. And you see, even if I take all the red, it is still struggling against the black. So some colors like black or red, they are very different in what amounts you should use if you just want to darken the red a little bit down. So you just take I don't know, very small tip of black on your brush to darken that red down. The other way around, if you want to get that red, if you want to get that black like a light red hue, same thing, right? Need to see that you have the right amount of red in there to achieve that. And the other thing is, if you mix colors, you will lose vibrancy. I can't give you the exact chemical reasons for why that is, but if you mix colors, and at some point you will only end up with a brown gray sludge on your wet palette. So that's why also with single pigments, it is then by default a little bit more vibrant than the pre-mixed ones. since when they mix, they just lose vibrancy. So that is, I think, also important, so that you don't wonder, oh, I mixed all the time, it was such a bright base, and now this looks quite dull in the end. It's then the reason that you probably mixed too many paints, and probably also mixed pigment paints. So then you would end up with something that is not as bright. So then it's maybe good to at some point go in with a fresh paint or just a pure paint from those that you mixed with, and to really get that vibrancy up again. So I think this is also a good thing to remember for your mixing journey. But yeah, I can only invite you to play around a bit and see what feels good for you. Maybe you can even start to go a little bit thinner than you think you would handle. Difficult thing here, or thing to remember, is the thinner you make it, the more water is in it, and then it might be a little bit too runny of your brush. So this is then also a good point where we just dab it lightly on a paper, like a kitchen paper or whatever you use to clean, then sucks a little bit of moisture out of the brush. Then you will have a better experience with the paint not being as runny, and you have more control when you apply it. So definitely also a good thing to remember there, especially important for glazing, where it usually goes super thin, and to not then end up with little pools of water that build up in the crevices or wherever. You just dab it lightly once on the cloth, and you then will see that there's quite the amount of excess water already sucked into the paper, and then you have more pigment on your brush to get that light glazing. And that should really make a difference, but definitely something you need to try out. There's also not one rule fits all. Maybe some people can handle this paint with this much water better than others, or like it that it behaves that way. So it's also up to you how you paint and what you feel the most comfortable with. So yeah, and then here we have this little guy just very briefly painted, a little bit of thin paint, and then he might be ready for the second coat at some point, maybe some highlights. Oh, leave him that way. We will see. All right, this is, I think, my 2 cents on that. Is there any question? Are there any questions around thinning paint, or anyone wants to share their experiences? I'm happy to jump into that. Yeah, for the remaining minutes that we have, I'm all yours for your questions or your remarks or your experiences. So yeah, feel free to jump in and type something in the chat. How can you avoid getting paint in the ferrule when you have paint at glazing consistency? That's a very great question, see. So I think that might sound, maybe it sounds more dumb than it is, but I think one thing is when you have it really thin on your palette, that you actually look how far up the paint goes up the bristles when you twist it over your palette, and then you see how far it goes. And then I would always recommend that you have like 1 millimeter or so, or just a little bit of not stained bristles left. So there's some pure bristles between the ferrule and the bristles with the paint. And that's actually how I do it. So you just gently pull it through the color and then see that there's no paint at the very end in the bristle. And then you can glaze away. Another thing is when you rinse your brushes and you then maybe are done for the day, I mean, it's probably not the worst thing in the world, but putting them up in a cup upright is probably not the best idea to dry them, because there might be still some water with a little bit of paint in it, and that would run down. So just put them flat on, or if you're really fancy, maybe that puts them with the tip down so that water is not running into the ferrule. Was that somewhat clear, Casey? Or should I elaborate more on that? It's just a little bit having an eye on how far the color goes up the bristles if you twist it through the color on your palette. But this is basically how I would do it. I mean, it's here now on the palette, then I twist it through and then I see, okay, there's like 2-3 millimeters of bristles that are still clear. That way I will do it with not getting paint in the ferrule. And also, what is still good and what I probably also not do as much as I should is rinse the brush more often. In general, I think sometimes I have quite long periods of time where I just paint, which is also good. I mean, with these, they hold paint quite a lot, and then you can also paint a while, but usually it's good to rinse it more often. So there's some, not any dry paint, that makes also cleaning easier. Yeah, that might be then, maybe it's still a bit too wet, that you have still too much water on it. So, I mean, there's also, you can maybe then dab a little bit with the tissue on the palette itself. So I almost have never any water puddles on my palette. I mean, this is also just a personal preference. I mean, if you look at, sometimes I almost cringe when I see how, I don't know, those Spanish masters paint. It looks like it's just water with a little bit of paint in there. But I mean, they have the benefit of the Spanish water, which I don't. So maybe that's the difference. But yeah, for me, it's mostly relatively, I mean, it's slightly moist, but it's not, there's no water buildup here, at least not a lot. So then I just drag it here through, and then I can control it quite well. So maybe you have a little bit too much water that is actually on the paper. Could try to dab it a little bit away, or just if you have it in the ferrule, just give it a quick dab on the tissue. So the most moisture that would run into the ferrule is then sucked out of the brush. Little last word on cleaning, as I mentioned it. Those brushes will hold much longer if you clean them properly, and there's things like brush soap, also quite a few brands, or brush conditioner. Sometimes it's in one bar of soap, so to say. I think I had like bought 1 bar of soap in the very beginning, and I still have it. It was, I don't know, $5 or $6, $7. I still use that, and it's really worth it. Then give it a little bit of wash, also dragging it down there and rinsing it with water and cleaning it with the fingers, and then in the end leaving just a little bit of soap in there, so that leaves a nice tip, that then also reinforces the form of the brush. So definitely worth it, and will extend the life of your brushes by a lot. So definitely clean your brushes, folks, and especially those expensive ones. Then you will actually have fun with them for quite a while and not have to buy them every few months. But again, at some point, every brush will have run its course. But with a good cleaning schedule, they will live quite long, and which is great. Yeah, I mean, again, Casey, paint consistency. I think this is not something that I can tell you how to do, or anyone can tell you how to do, and then it would be the perfect solution. I think it's more about testing a little bit, doing it on minis maybe that you don't really care that much about, and then just paint around a bit. Yes, Lamin Medium. Actually, I'm a big fan of Lamin Medium. I found out about it quite early also when they said, hey, you can use Lamin Medium to make your own washes. And I was like, this is fantastic. You know, I can just use any paint and use Lamin Medium. But you can also use it for thinning your paint. Yeah, it will help with stability. And because it's a little bit thicker, it's like a carrier medium that they sell you. And yeah, you can actually try if that works better for you. Some people actually use it for glazing quite well. I mean, there's also stuff like glazing medium, which I think is relatively similar in how it works. But yeah, Lamin Medium is great, especially if you do washes. If I intend to make a wash, I also use Lamy medium and then use the color that I want, or mix the color that I want and then use a little bit of Lamy medium to make my own wash, because it then actually flows much better and behaves more like a wash and not like a too much thinned paint or too watery paint, because it's a little bit more thick and has this, I can't really describe it, but this consistency that just seems to be more stable than that. But yeah, we are already through. If there's still some last questions, happy to answer. But if not, let me say a few words. I think, yeah, we discussed about the tools that you would need to start your painting journey, some tips for how to build your mini, what to do when you want to prime it, and then also discuss a little bit paint consistency and how to put the paint on the mini itself. So yeah, I think this might have been a good overview, I hope. Happy to get some feedback. You will find me on the Discord as Matthias, or Panlord Matthias, as I was graced with that title. So feel free also to tag me there if you have further questions. And talking about paints and colors, just following up now is actually a nice class about color theory. So if you want to have a little bit more insight into that, we have two lovely hosts that will discuss colors and how to use them in which combination. So yeah, wish you a lot of fun with that. Thanks for attending. Thanks. This was quite helpful, at least a little bit for you. I enjoyed it a lot. And yeah, happy to have kicked off this year's SquidCon. And I wish you a nice Friday afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. And then still have a lot of fun with the SquidCon.